Now, you don't have to buy that, but if you're interested in the idea, then you can read Nietzsche, because that's what he was trying to sort out. And it wasn't only Nietzsche who came to that conclusion. It was many people have come to that conclusion, but I think the two who've outlined it most spectacularly were Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. And Nietzsche is an unbelievably influential philosopher. You know, I don't think there was anyone that was more influential during the entire course of the 20th century, excepting a very, very tiny handful of other people, excepting the scientists. We won't bother with their discussion. You could put Marx in that category. You could put Freud in that category partly. But after that, the list starts to get a lot thinner, you know. So maybe there's 10 people up in that level. And Dostoevsky, of course, I think, I mean, if anybody ever prepares a list of the top 10 greatest literary figures in the world, he would be in the top 10 list. You know, I think he's perhaps second to Shakespeare and maybe above Shakespeare in my estimation. So these aren't trivial people we're talking about, and they weren't dealing with trivial issues. Well, so then the question might be, what's at the bottom of the idea of a transcendent value? And I wanted to approach that staying out of the metaphysical domain as much as possible, because you can claim anything you want from a metaphysical perspective, and that's a big problem. And so people will say, well, why come up with the hypothesis of God, for example? God could be anything. There's a satire. The flying spaghetti monster, right, is a classic satirical representation of a deity that the atheist types use to buttress their arguments. And fair enough, you know, as a satirical idea, it's pretty damn funny. But there's things about this that aren't the least bit amusing. And the thing that's not amusing is, well, what, if anything, is our culture predicated on? Okay, so what happened? Well, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky put forth this set of propositions. And out of Dostoevsky's line of thinking, to some degree, grew Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn documented the absolute horrors of equity-predicated Soviet society, you know, and we don't learn about that. Right? This I don't understand, is that what happened in the 20th century on the radical left end of the spectrum is not well documented. Students don't learn about it. Why the hell is that? We learn about World War II. We learn about what happened in the Holocaust, and fair enough, we absolutely should. But nobody knows. It's a mystery to everyone when I talk about what happened in the Soviet Union, and that's absolutely appalling. And that's to say nothing about what happened in China, which was equally horrible. The system didn't work. It was predicated on the wrong values, unless you think that that sort of thing means worked, you know, because you have to define that as well. But it collapsed under its own weight after it killed tens of millions of people. That doesn't really, and still, it's not like Russia has recovered. It doesn't seem to me like that's a very good definition of worked. Now, whatever we're doing in the West seems to work for all of its flaws. And the question is, are we just deceiving ourselves? Is it just arbitrary power politics and opinion? Or is there something at the bottom of it? So when Solzhenitsyn wrote the Gulag Archipelago, he believed that the Russians would have to return to Orthodox Christianity to find their pathway forward. And that's, of course, has made him into a reactionary in the eyes of many of his critics. But that is perhaps what is happening in Russia, although it's very difficult to tell, because Putin also seems to be using his affiliation with the Orthodox Christian Church as a means to consolidate power. So the situation in Russia is unclear, but a religious revival, if that's happening in Russia, and perhaps it isn't, but if it is happening, is something that unfolds over decades and even centuries. So it's not an easy thing to evaluate when it first starts to happen. But Solzhenitsyn drew the same conclusions that Dostoevsky did fundamentally, not in exactly the same way, but very, very close. He believed, as far as I could tell, that unless people were willing to adhere to some sort of transcendent value, that they had no protection against pathological ideologies and no protection against the murderous impulses that came along with them. And I found his work I found his writing credible, powerful and credible. I don't know how you can read that book and not draw that kind of conclusion. I think people who criticize Solzhenitsyn have never read the damn book, because that book is like, it's like going into the ring with Muhammad Ali and being pummeled to death for half an hour. You know, you don't recover from it that easily. So then Jung branched off of Nietzsche. And so Nietzsche's idea was that people would have to create their own values, roughly speaking. And I think that's where Nietzsche's is his weakest, because it isn't obvious to me that people can create their own values. And I think he fell into, and I don't want to be a casual critic of Nietzsche, because that's always dangerous, given that he probably had an IQ of 260. You know, I mean, he was way the hell out there in the stratosphere, and just when you think you've understood what he was talking about, you can be bloody well sure that you didn't. But it does seem to me, and he was running out of time. He died young, you know, and he was trying to solve this problem in a rush, I would say. And he hypothesized that people would have to become supermen, overmen, roughly speaking, in order to deal with the death of God. And that idea sort of branched off into Nazi propaganda, because that's in some sense what the Nazis were trying to do with their promotion of the perfect Aryan. You know, now it's a misappropriation of Nietzsche in my estimation. And it was partly because his sister, who was a perverse creature, what would you say, doctored his work in such a way so that it was more easily appropriated by the Nazis. But there is some danger in what he said too, because you know, the question is, well, if you're going to transform yourself into the giver of values, what stops you from inflating yourself into something like a demigod and just pronouncing what the values are going to be? So that's a problem. You know, you're going to replace tradition with yourself. Well, there's dangers in that, because there's nothing to keep you humble. That's the most appropriate objection. There's nothing to keep you humble. And those things can spiral out of control very rapidly. And they did, say, in the case of Hitler. I mean, it's easy to blame what happened in Germany on Hitler, but that's a big mistake, because it was a dialogue between Hitler and the German people, right? Hitler didn't create himself. It was co-creation. He said things, people listened and told him back what to say. And then he said them and they listened and they told him back what to say. And it looped until he was the mouthpiece of their darkest desires. Now that's a game he was willing to play. But you can't think about that as, it isn't like Hitler created Nazi Germany. Hitler and the Germans co-created Nazi Germany. You know, when a leader gives articulation to the imagination of the population. That's what a leader does. And, you know, you could say that, well, maybe Hitler filtered what the Germans were telling him through a particular lens, because he had no shortage of resentment and desire for revenge in his own heart, you know. It's not like his life was a spectacular success before he became a political activist, and he was brutalized very badly in World War I, and he didn't get to pursue his primary dream, which was to be an art student in Vienna, and he had applied 3 times and got rejected all 3 times, and so he was bitter about that. He was basically living on the streets after World War I. He wasn't the world's happiest person, and I'm sure he carried a fair bit of resentment in his heart when he was in the trenches in World War I. In one experience that he had, all of his friends were killed by a mortar when he had wandered off to go do something else. So, you know, it's hard to even imagine what something like that would do to you. But I can tell you, when you're the only survivor out of 20 people, that's also going to give you an enhanced sense of your own specialness, because the alternative is just to think about how goddamn arbitrary the universe really is. So Jung studied Nietzsche in great detail, and he was particularly interested because Jung had his finger on the central problems all the time, right? Because he was a great psychologist, and he was listening to what people said, and he was a staggering genius as well. And so, like Nietzsche or Dostoevsky or Solzhenitsyn, he was that kind of prophetic type, I would say. And he understood as well, perhaps, what was wrong with Nietzsche's formulation, the idea that people could only create their own values, and that's what would replace the foundation that was now lacking under Western civilization itself. And he came to his conclusion, I would say, through Freud, because Freud started analyzing parts of the human cognitive process and content that people hadn't attended to before in any great detail, and that was primarily dreams. You know, the idea of dream analysis, I suppose, is one of perhaps Freud's major contribution to modern Western thought. The idea was there was something to dreams. And I suppose what Freud did is said, hey, look, isn't it strange? We have this whole other form of thought that we engage in at night. and it speaks in a language that we don't really understand. And so what the hell is that? And you can say, and many modern people do, dreams are of no significance, or even that they're random processes, which is an absurd proposition, obviously, because they're whatever they are, they're obviously not random. So Freud's idea was that there was something in dreams that was informative. So now he had a method for extracting out from the dream what the dream purported to represent. And he outlined that in great detail in The Interpretation of Dreams. And if you want to read one book by Freud, I would highly recommend that one. It's a very long book and it's very detailed, but Freud does an extraordinarily comprehensive analysis of the way that dreams work. Now he made because he had brought a theoretical framework to bear even on his investigation into dream structure, he concluded that dreams were essentially wish fulfillments. And that's where Jung and Freud disagreed. He also believed that the primary motivating factor of human beings was sexual. And now that's a tougher one to toss aside, because even if you're a Darwinian rather than a Freudian, you're going to obviously support the proposition that sexual motivation among any living creature is going to be one of the highest order motivations, because otherwise creatures don't reproduce and prevail over the long run. So the question is that the ultimate source of motivation? And in some sense, the answer to that has to be yes. Well, Freud wanted to make that in some ways the sole source of motivation. And I'm oversimplifying, and I hate to do that in relationship to Freud, because he was not a simple-minded character. Jung had a dream once, if I remember correctly, that Freud and Jung were excavating a basement. And so Freud had already discovered the basement, let's say, so that would be the unconscious structure of the psyche. And Jung broke through into another basement that was a multi-chambered place, so many, many, many rooms. And I suppose what drove Jung and Freud apart was Jung's proposition that there was a hell of a lot more going on down there than had already met the eye. And they broke on the idea that the sexual impulse was primary, roughly speaking. They broke when Jung wrote a book called Symbols of Transformation, which is actually, there's 3 books that I know of that are sort of like maps of meaning. One is Symbols of Transformation. One is a book by Erich Neumann called The Origins and History of Consciousness. And the third one, well, is Maps of Meaning. They're the same book. They're just like they're trying to solve the same problem from 3 different directions. They're all attempts to address the same problem. And so Symbols of Transformation was a book that Jung wrote about the fantasies of a schizophrenic American woman. And he was trying to relate her fantasies to these old mythological ideas. And Jung's idea, essentially, and this is an idea that was shared by people like Piaget, so we're not going to say that Jung or Freud just pulled this idea out of the air, was that the birthplace of mythology and literature, for that matter, was the dream. That they share structural, that they share what? Mode of information presentation. And it's a relatively radical hypothesis, but given that they both represent dreams and mythological representations share an essentially narrative structure, and they're literary like, I mean, it's not so unreasonable to notice that a dream at night is like the movie that you play in your head. And it's not unreasonable to note as well that the dreams that you have at night bear a relationship to the daydreams that you have during the day. It's a form of cognition. It seems like an involuntary form of cognition, though, and that's a very strange thing. So Jung thought about the dream as nature speaking of its own accord, roughly speaking. And so his idea was, well, when you sleep, you dream, but the dream happens to you. It's not something that you create the way that, and you don't even think about creating it. Because I might say, well, what are you thinking about? And you'll say, I'm thinking about whatever it is, and you'll take credit in some sense for thinking that, because it seems like a voluntary activity. But what happens at night is that you think, but you think involuntarily. And so what Jung would say is that means that something is thinking in you. And that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it. And this is one of the things that's uncanny about the psychoanalysts, is they were willing to take their observations to their logical conclusion. There are things that think in you. What are those things?